The myth of Pandora's box tells of a curiosity so intense that would lead Pandora to open a container and release unexpected physical and emotional curses upon mankind. Indeed, Pandora's box has since been understood to mean any source of great and unexpected troubles, or alternatively, a present which seems valuable but which in reality is a curse. If you were faced with this opportunity to quench your curiosity by opening such a container, would you? Would your need to investigate be greater than your sense of potential foreboding? Well, what if you instead actually had 7 of these boxes? What if the more you searched through them, the more it appeared this was indeed an ongoing source of great and unexpected troubles? And while curiosity may at times kill the cat, what if you couldn't shake the sense that something was still missing? Would you continue to labour through your version of Pandora's boxes? As much as we think we know, this is where we unpack so much directly from the Pandora's boxes that would fill in the gaps regarding the death of Phil Walsh here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I'm once again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all you listeners out there for joining us and also for the feedback you've been giving us on this series so far.
Yeah, feedback indeed has been curious, interesting, and very much appreciated. On that, before we begin, a huge thank you to everyone who is listening and has provided that feedback. If you haven't heard our previous episodes, we would strongly recommend and greatly appreciate you heading straight over to iTunes and Spotify, subscribing, rating, reviewing, all of those wonderful things. That's how you help us get our work out to the masses and how you can catch up on our journey so far. As we continue this episode in this series, we just want to remind you once again, if you find anything distressing or you have someone you know who's in a vulnerable mental state, please make use of the following resources if you're local. That's, of course, from the South Australian Government Mental Health Triage Service on 131 465. They're a 24/7 service that provides advice and information on mental health emergency situations. And of course, the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line on 131 466. If you have someone in a vulnerable situation, they can call on your behalf and they can certainly help them through this time. I have rushed through that, Sean, because I don't want to delay. I don't want to wait. I want to pick up exactly where we left off from the last episode, where you dropped the bombshell and we talked about it. Well, I talked about it just before. We had these boxes of, just document after document. I've got 7 boxes. I called them Pandora's boxes because it seems like the more you investigated, the more you uncovered, and the more you still had a sense there was just something missing.
That's right, because as I was digging through the thousands and thousands of pages in these 7 photocopying paper boxes full of all the witness statements in the killing of Phil Walsh, everyone was talking about something called Greylands. Everybody was hinting about Western Australia. Everybody was hinting about the incident in Western Australia. And it was like being in a room where you're the only person that's not in on the secret. All these conversations are going on around me, so to speak, in the form of documents. And everybody else knows what's happening except me. And I'm missing very vital context to understand all of this. And as these things happen, the document that I needed to give context to everything else in these boxes of paperwork was right at the bottom of the final box.
It's almost that whole, where did you find? It's the last place you look is where you find something.
Yeah, where'd you leave your keys? The very last place you looked for them.
Of course, you wouldn't continue to look, but it's interesting you say that. It's almost as if that, you said it before, people would accuse you of writing a script for some of this stuff. It's one of those moments where you couldn't have written that better if it was a screenplay. The very last document in the very last box, after all of this toiling through this and trying to decipher and understand and digest this information, you get that really essential, necessary, required document that just puts that final piece into place.
And I think it was because it was the earliest in time. As we said at the end of our last episode, this is an incident that happened a full 12 months before Cy Walsh killed his father, AFL Crows coach Phil Walsh.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's toward the bottom. If you're stacking things as a police officer, if you're just getting all the evidence together to send it to court, the earliest statement in time is going to be at the bottom of the stack because you've been stacking all the other witness statements you've been getting on top of them. Nothing suspicious or malicious about it, just really damn frustrating for a journalist who is, as we said, basically hiding in a corner of the registry on the ground floor of the state's busiest courthouse, trying hard not to be noticed by the rest of the media, trying to get as much notation out of these 7 boxes of documents as he can before somebody asks him what he's doing.
And it's interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think that, I won't call it the smoking gun in this instance, but that document that ties it all together would be the very first, or in your case, the very last document in that pile. You would think potentially toward the back end or the chronological order, some of the last documentation would probably fill in that, but it was really the converse of that, so that very sort of first instant. I mean, that's the key to this. That's where we need to come back to. So you've mentioned you mentioned this concept of greylands, you've mentioned Western Australia, and you mentioned a street fight, and I'm trying to decipher that, just as perhaps you were at the time. Help me understand, how does, firstly, Western Australia play into it? Where do we get Western Australia out of all of this?
Okay, so before we get into that, I want to front load that with this. I'm going to take everybody out of the time narrative for a moment. For my money, what we're going to talk about in this episode is the single biggest piece of the Phil Walsh tragedy that gets overlooked.
Okay.
Every time this gets talked about, the incident in Western Australia and the ramifications thereof and all the evidence surrounding it gets forgotten. So I want all of you out there listening to keep that in mind, because no matter what you think you know about this case, unless you've really absorbed everything I've ever written on the subject, this could conceivably be new information to you. That's what I want to say leading into this.
And look, we did say, a few episodes ago, we were going to provide information that potentially people weren't aware of, hadn't heard, and we're going to give them a different perspective on the way that came to light as well.
So the reason we're in Perth, we're in Perth in May 2014, full 12 calendar months before Phil Walsh dies.
Yeah.
Cy Walsh is a student at this point, and he's studying at university in Western Australia. In fact, he's a student at the University of Western Australia. Now, you'll remember that the Walsh family moved around a fair bit as Phil's coaching job took them to different places.
And Western Australia was the last place he was before he came back to Adelaide.
That's right. Now, Cy, being a grown adult at this point, over the age of 18, completely in charge of his own life, he opts to stay in Western Australia and continue studying there. May 3rd, 2014. Cy becomes convinced that that's the date the world is going to end. And more specifically, it's going to end during a particular event.
Okay.
Cy's planning to go to a concert by the band Bliss and Esso. It's on May 3rd, 2014. Cy's convinced that during that concert, the world will end.
Do we know where that idea or concept came from at all?
There is no information as to where.
Yeah,
it just
right.
pops up.
Okay.
And it pops up by virtue of Cy's interactions with other people in the days leading up to the 3rd of May.
Right.
The first incident is, of course, him at university, and he asks to speak privately with the university's professional practice coordinator, Dr. Lisa Bell. He was living in a share house at the time. So this is on May 1st. Dr. Bell recalls in her statement that Walsh was, and I quote, freaking all over the place and saying things like, you know what's happening, because he believed that they, meaning Cy and Dr. Bell, were communicating telepathically.
Okay.
She says, he said things to me about South America and having discovered something there which had given him insight and enlightenment. He talked of experimenting with this company in a tribe in South America. She then says Walsh, her words, flipped again and started speaking about his father. She's very uncomfortable at this point, she recalls in her statement, and she says, look, Cy, I think I'm going to leave the room. He blocked her exit from the room, spread his arms in what she referred to as a messiah pose, while saying, "It will come to you." She then said that she was scared, told Cy that, so he bowed and ran at high speed down the corridor. That's the last she saw of him.
That's a far from common experience. You'd think it's a very unique situation, and you can understand the awkward and uncomfortableness of Dr. Bell during that interaction.
But I want to flip that on its head a little bit too. Let's think about the awkwardness and discomfort that Cy Walsh was feeling in that moment, because this is a reaching out for help at this point. This is Cy going to someone who is in a place of authority within the university, the structure and system that he's living in, saying that he's afraid the world is going to end and he wants to talk to somebody about it. And he is incapable, for whatever reason at that moment, of getting that information out. Now, back at this point, when I'm reading this document, I'm thinking to myself back about the same kid who went around to all the adults and wanted to know books that inspired them so he could be like them. This misfit kid that people have described who had trouble articulating his thoughts and wanted to talk about these big ideas and big concerns and wasn't always understood. Here we have another situation of the same thing again when he's in a point of crisis. He's convinced the world's going to end.
Yeah.
I mean, let's cast back to our series on Jade and Loa. That's not a comfortable place to be.
No.
If something in you is saying that the world is going to end, that there's threat everywhere, you want help and assistance, but you're not capable of reaching out for it in the most articulate manner.
And that's probably a really good comparison if we talk about that. Because, I mean, if we have a look at that, as you said, within Jade and Loa's perspective, he was thinking he's in almost an artificial world trying to get out of a simulation. This here, with Cy talking about, he's got a prophecy almost that the world is going to end. And as Dr. Bell put it, standing in a Messiah-like pose and absolutely convinced that he's able to respond and talk to her telepathically and communicate in that method, that's certainly not something that we would consider normal behaviour. It certainly starts to paint a picture that Cy himself at this stage is already in an altered state.
Daniel, you said the Messiah pose and the words that Cy was saying gave you the indication as a reader, as a listener, that Cy was in some kind of altered state at that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now remember, we've broken this down artificially. We've grouped the information in those 7 Pandora's boxes into 3 categories. The first category, which we dealt with on our previous episode, this category, which is all about the relationship between father and son, and our final category, which is all about the incident itself.
Yeah.
In real time, though, I'm reading that document and I'm having the exact same feeling you're having about Cy's obviously in some kind of altered state. Wait a minute. Didn't I read something 5 boxes back about a Bliss and Esso concert? Yeah. And so I start digging backwards now, going back to documents I've already looked at for further context because I might have ignored something or not taken a note because it didn't make sense to me or whatever. So I find myself back at the statement of Stephen Trobiani.
Yeah.
Stephen Trobiani was, you'll remember, one of Cy's friends. In fact, he was one of the ones that first explained to us all about ayahuasca. He said that Cy called it the medicine, and that while he was living in Perth, Cy consumed ayahuasca with a group of friends he called the community.
Yeah.
He became interested in psychotropic drugs and he thought everybody should do them. So I went back to Stephen Trobiani's statement, cross-referencing. Sure enough, Stephen Trobiani, I believe Cy was consuming ayahuasca daily while living in Perth. He was becoming increasingly erratic and was expressing views that the world was going to end at a Bliss and Esso concert on March 3, 2014.
And I'm glad you brought us back to that because as you say that was when you were saying just before that, that piece around Dr. Bell's statement about Bliss and Esso, that rang a bell that you talked about Bliss and Esso once before. I know that we had mentioned Perth before. We'd certainly talked about ayahuasca, and in this that Dr. Bell was talking about had found something in South America, and I'm like, okay, I'm starting to. This is all sounding familiar and vaguely just coherently putting dots together. This is making sense.
So we're sparing you out there in listener land some of the detective work I've had to do to, red string connect everything together. And we're trying to present it to you in a more holistic, understandable way. But please, put yourself in the mindset of we're piecing this together in real time as I was back in the day.
Yeah.
So I think a bit harder and I'm like, well, hang on. What about the Aeneas? You remember Oliver and Harrison Annear?
Yeah.
The young men who were family friends of the Walshes.
That's right.
And in fact, there was that connection, very deep connection between Phil and the Annear boys, both of whom played football. Kim Annear, their mother, was the one who said, Cy came to me and asked me about books that I'd read that he wanted to read. And, you know, a lot of the things he said struck me as odd. Well, what struck me was there's more about this Perth connection if I go back to those documentations. Sure enough, there was. Harrison Annear, who at that point was still living in Perth and was a Facebook friend, he's strong to say, of Cy Walsh's, gets called by his parents. Phil and Meredith have somehow found out about what Cy did in the university.
So the incident with Dr. Bell.
That's right.
Okay.
Reached out to the Annears and said, hey, can you check on Cy for us? We're a little concerned.
Yeah.
So, of course, what do parents do? You ring the kids and you say, hey, can you go check on Cy for us? So Harrison gets the gig to go out and speak to Cy. He says he attends the share house where Cy is living. We have a conversation. The conversation was all about shamans, and the world was going to end at some point, and he said I had a halo above my head. Cy said that he thought Walshy, meaning Phil, thought he was a disappointment, and that he didn't love him because he didn't play football. I reassured him, telling him that wasn't true. But Cy said something along the lines of Walshy would rather he had a son more like me or my brothers, because we were all sporty. While Harrison's trying to calm Cy down, Cy says, just stay right here. I want to show you my samurai sword.
Yeah, that's never an encouraging statement.
Harrison says, I freaked out. And so I went outside and I called Phil. And I said, look, Phil, things are going down here. He wants to show me a samurai sword. I think you really need to come over and speak to Cy. Seconds later, he says, Cy followed him carrying a kitchen knife and, in a super calm, firm, and definite manner, told Harrison, it's time to go. Now, Harrison says, I was having surgery on my knee the next day, and I remember thinking, if he comes at me with that knife, I can't run.
Yeah.
And so he very carefully, very slowly backed away, back to his car, while Cy's standing there in the doorway with the kitchen knife, gets in his car, and leaves.
So Cy's essentially standing with a knife telling him it's time to get off of my property, get out of here.
Absolutely. I'm not interested in having this conversation anymore.
Okay.
Very, very confronting stuff. And as I say, the pieces are starting to come together for me now.
Yeah.
Why is ayahuasca relevant? Why is Perth relevant? Because this is where he's living, consuming these psychotropic drugs in this share house with the group that he calls the community.
Yep.
Harrison's gone around there to try to sort things out, and it's turned violent.
Yep.
Not physically violent, but intimidation violence, you know?
Absolutely.
Pulling a knife on someone, I'm sorry, I don't care what you do and don't with it. You pull a knife on someone, that's a violent act.
That is an intimidation act, as you said. That's a threatening act.
So Harrison calls Phil again and says, this has just happened. I'm okay. I'm in the car. I'm safe. But I really need you to come over here. You're going to have to do something about this. And Phil says instantly, I'll fly across to Perth. Keep in mind, this is the man who was so dedicated to football. By his own admission, he felt like he'd missed out on so many things in life.
Yeah.
Felt like he could have been more of a father. Here he is, stepping up to exactly what he said he was going to do. In fact, he missed Port's interstate game with Greater Western Sydney.
Right.
Just let the team know, look, I'm not coming to Greater Western Sydney.
Yeah.
I got to go.
Sure.
Port power player Kane Corns was really concerned about this, and he reached out to Phil. That was another statement that I had to go back and find.
Sure.
A little tingling of memory. Kane had said, I messaged Phil at night to check on him. He responded and advised me that he was working through something with Cy, but he didn't elaborate.
Okay.
All right, so I've done all my cross-referencing now. Here's the next piece of paper, underneath Dr. Bell's statement. And it's a statement by a guy called Ian McGregor Tom.
Okay.
Ian McGregor Tom is not a footballer. He's not a police officer. He's not a psychologist. He's an ordinary guy who lives in Perth.
So the question there, Sean, would be how does this person fit into this equation?
Because he happened to be walking down Edward Street in May 2014 when he saw an older man charge out of nowhere and crash tackle a younger man to the ground.
Okay.
This is a police incident statement.
Oh.
This is one of the things that the cops take from an eyewitness to a crime.
Sure.
And he describes, the younger man starts shouting, "Why don't you leave me alone? Leave me alone. I'm out of here." It was a bit of a screaming match, but really only one of them was doing the talking, says Mr. Tom, and it was the younger one. They began fighting on the footpath, and that scuffle moved into the middle of Edward Street. So now this young man and this older man are fighting in the traffic in downtown Perth. It's Cy Walsh and it's Phil Walsh.
Yeah.
Mr. Tom says that once the older man pinned the younger man down, the younger man's demeanour changed quite remarkably from aggressive to almost euphoric. And he recounts this exchange. He said the younger man said, "Oh, Dad, when you grabbed me and lifted me into the air, we were so connected. Dad, it was beautiful. Did you feel it? We were together." He says the father didn't really communicate with his son at all. I think he was exhausted and distressed. The young man began to speak about the world being a beautiful place, saying something like his dad should be there with him. He would like it. He also said, "This is bad, Dad. It's no good. I can't help it," and began sobbing.
Tough to hear that, and also almost confusing at that point, like trying to, I guess, put myself in that state of understanding what we're actually listening to here. Phil has gone to Perth, he's gone to find Cy. Obviously, they've had some sort of incident which has turned into this scuffle, this fight, as you say, into the street in the middle of traffic. And then something very, very dynamically and interesting happens where it's gone from this aggressive kind of outburst from Cy to, as you said, almost euphoric, this I won't call it calmness, but this understanding and peacefulness of wanting his dad to come along. And he clearly felt a connection with his dad in that moment in a very unique situation. Forget physically, Phil must have been incredibly mentally and emotionally just spent as well, trying to comprehend what's going on with his son here.
Based on what I've pieced together from the other bits and pieces of witness statements, Phil had been all but chasing Cy around Perth.
Yeah.
On foot, in cars, multiple telephone calls,
Okay.
trying to track him down. And when he finally tracked him down, he just took direct action. I mean, he was so concerned about Cy's mental state in that moment that the best thing he could think of doing was using all of his football prowess to take the kid down and try to prevent him from hurting himself or anyone else in that moment. I mean, think about it. He's menaced a woman at a university by this point. He's pulled a knife on an injured man.
Yeah.
You're not taking any chances at that point.
You're not. And as a father from a parental situation, you're probably thinking, what do I need to do from a responsible situation to ensure that he doesn't threaten, hurt, harm anyone else at this stage as well?
Spare a thought also for Western Australian police. You get a call to say that two people are brawling in the middle of a CBD street. You turn up with certain expectations. You get there and you discover not only is it a father-son situation, not only is it some kind of incapacity situation, but it's your former coach. It's Phil Walsh. It's a celebrity.
Yes.
It's a known name in Western Australia.
No, you're right there, Sean. Even if at the time you don't necessarily recognise him by face, as soon as you get the name, in Western Australia, you're going to have some level of celebrity and be known for being on the coaching staff of the West Coast Eagles. You're quite right.
And as an officer, you're coming in with the information that older man has crash-tackled younger man. So from a law enforcement perspective, you're going to stop the older man from doing damage. You grab him, oh, sorry, coach. Hi, what's going on? That makes this even more difficult. To me, it also speaks to the level of father Phil Walsh was. He didn't care about any of that stuff at the time. He just wanted to look after his son.
Very, very confronting so far, but we now have an understanding of, I guess, the lead up to Perth and now how we get to Perth and what size background was happening in that sense. Now we know Phil's there. This is getting very, very interesting and obviously leading into that document you were talking about before where we've come to understand the concept of greylands.
Finally, I'm at the point where I'm ready to understand this mysterious reference all the way through the other documents to greylands. And it comes in the form of a psychological evaluation from consultant psychiatrist Dr. Ann Bell, who works at the Greylands Secure Mental Health Facility in Western Australia.
Hang on, we had another Dr. Bell from the university.
That's right.
Not the same doctor?
Not the same doctor, no relation as far as I could tell.
Okay, so just for continuity, just wanted to piece that out as I'm trying to follow along with this story so far.
And look, I did the same thing. At the time I went, wait a minute.
Yeah.
No, different
Okay.
Dr. Bell.
Okay, so this Dr. Bell.
And this is what Greylands is. Greylands is the equivalent of James Nash House here in
Okay.
South Australia. We've talked on our previous episodes about how James Nash House works, what it does. It's the secure mental health facility. Greylands is the West Coast equivalent.
So obviously from this altercation, this has been dealt with from the police at that stage, and as a result of that, we've now determined that Cy needs to spend some time in this facility.
That's right. There was an initial examination
Sure.
within police custody, and the decision was made to transfer him to Greylands, where he came under the care of Dr. Ann Bell.
Okay.
And Dr. Bell's statement was, look, it was difficult to read. I'm not au fait with a lot of psychological or psychiatric evaluations.
Sure.
Again, we're in territory that journalists normally don't get to see. But there was a lot of tick boxes and a lot of jargon and a lot of half sentences. So apologies for the way that my grammar goes in the toilet for the next couple of minutes, because
Okay.
I want to give this to you as it was given to me.
Sure.
So Dr. Bell says that Walsh presented with bizarre thoughts, uncharacteristic violence toward father, and poorly framed paranoid delusions. She said Walsh's personality was on the odd eccentric spectrum, where a person has unusual beliefs but is not delusional.
Okay.
Think about that for a minute. There's a spectrum there of odd to eccentric. He's on that particular spectrum.
Yeah.
Unusual beliefs, but not delusional.
Yeah, I was trying to wrap my head as you were saying that. I don't know if you could see that, and the listeners at home might have taken that. I was mentally trying to follow that continuity along what that actually means.
I'll tell you what my reaction was on the day as I'm reading this. Kid thought the world was going to end in 48 hours' time. How is that not delusional?
Yeah.
Why does that not reach the bar that says this is a delusional belief? It's not a rational belief that the world's going to end in 48 hours at a Bliss and Esso concert, so your father has to crash tackle you in the CBD.
Well, to that point though, Sean, is it not to contend that on a spectrum of odd to eccentric, it's an unusual belief? Maybe it's a very strongly held unusual belief. Maybe it's verging toward delusional, yet not fully delusional. I'm just trying to understand. If it's a spectrum, then there's different perspectives, elements, there's different variations along that landscape, surely.
Clearly, for a change, you're more forgiving than I.
Well, I'm just trying to understand how that must work. And if it is a landscape, if it is a spectrum, it sits somewhere on there. It possibly, by the sounds of it, you and I both seem to contend it certainly falls into the upper half toward delusional. Maybe it's not entirely delusional.
Maybe not. Maybe Dr. Bell might want to reach out and let us know.
Possibly.
In any event, what interested me most was what came next.
Okay.
There was a preliminary diagnosis. That preliminary diagnosis, sorry, I'm going to correct myself. It was a provisional diagnosis.
Right.
Not even preliminary, provisional. That provisional diagnosis was that Cy Walsh was suffering from drug-induced psychosis.
Okay.
Let's dial back to what we know about Section 269 for a minute within South Australia.
Sure.
Granted, we're in Perth, but for a moment, let's come back to South Australia.
Yep.
Drug-induced psychosis is not an excuse for crime.
Correct.
Does not provide a defence at law.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
If you take enough stuff to make yourself quote-unquote crazy,
Yep.
then you are not able to say that you could not realise the wrongfulness of your actions.
Because you have, by definition, brought that upon yourself within your use of illicit substances.
You've removed your inhibitions, you've intoxicated yourself.
Sure.
Now, why did Dr. Bell come up with this conclusion? Well, as she said, Cy told us he has been using a South American healing plant called ayahuasca and said he had used this plant 6 weeks before the incident. Cy also reported what he described as paranoia about his father. 6 weeks before this incident.
This is an interesting point, Sean, because you were alluding to it was 269. This is what I was thinking. If this is back then, we know that this is a provisional diagnosis of, drug-induced schizophrenia. That shifts my thinking and my thought process around, I guess, responsibility, competence, and I'm starting to rehash my thoughts around, do I have a position on this at this stage, and if so, what does that look like? Because that doesn't sit well with me with 269 at this stage.
Because think of where I was at that point.
Yeah.
We are, and again, we're back in time here, folks. We are just removed in the time scale. Sean's sitting there taking all this notation, knowing the last thing he heard was that Cy's hair was being taken for a toxicology test.
Yes.
I said to you at the time that I suspected that must mean there were concerns about drug-induced psychosis.
Yep.
Here they are right here.
Yeah.
Because obviously and understandably, major crime and South Australian police have gone, well, if the incident back in Perth was drug-induced, surely this was drug-induced as well. What did Cy say when he was arrested? Do I need to have my stomach pumped?
Because he said he had taken some pills.
You put those two things together, the past evidence and that comment, it's not looking good at all. You're looking straight down the barrel of we need to test this as much as we can because we do not believe, as authorities at this point, that there is a reasonable argument that this is a, for want of a much better term, naturally occurring mental illness. We are thinking at this point that this has got to be the ayahuasca. This has got to be the psychotropics. This kid's got a history of having this stuff. He's been to South America. You and I have talked about that.
Yep.
The Japanese girlfriend looking for Endgame. My new thoughts on that. Everything's leading at this point as I'm digging through these documents to, damn, this is going to be a drug-induced psychosis.
Yeah.
Everything is saying that to me right now. Cy's not the only one, though, mentioned in a medical report in this documentation. I remember something about Kane Corns' statement. Remember, he talked about Cy being a little bit odd. He also talked in his statement about Phil having given up on that game to go after Cy. So I went back to Kane Corns' statement again. Phil was also injured in the brawl, he says. Now, this will give you some idea of what that brawl was like. I asked Phil about what had happened. He told me that he had flown to Perth to look for Cy as he was having a mental episode. He told me that he had to have an altercation with him in order to try to restrain him. Phil suffered a cut on his head, and I believe he might have torn a hamstring in the altercation.
Yeah, right.
For a man as physically fit as Phil Walsh, to tear a hamstring, that's no mild altercation.
No, that's some physical exertion there under some duress.
Now, I started digging through the paperwork backwards and forwards, not that there was much left to go forwards, to try to find out how much time Cy Walsh had spent in Greylands. Interestingly, there was no record of his attendance. Just that he went in after the arrest, but nothing about his discharge date. Nothing at all.
That's very, very odd.
To this day, I cannot tell you when Cy Walsh left Greylands mental health facility.
Okay.
I just do not know. There is not a record that I can access.
Right.
I'm sure there's one somewhere.
Yeah.
But it didn't form part of the brief of evidence.
Okay.
The next record I found was July 21st, 2014. A couple of months later, a statement from Dr. Paula Barry, a general practitioner based at the University of Western Australia.
Okay.
Because, of course, these big university town type situations have their own shops, post offices, and even doctors. She said that Cy came to consult with her. I'm like, okay, so by July 21st, he's out of Greylands and he's back at the university.
So we're talking a period of a month, 2 months maximum here.
Maximum. Got to be. Okay. Could be even less.
Yeah.
She said, Cy Walsh recounted the brawl with his father as an incredible coincidence, similar to his communication with angels. He said, people around me were worried, but to me, it was just magical. She says that over subsequent visits, Walsh's delusions eased and then finally ceased due to medication. And by August 8, he reported having, quote, a spring in his step, unquote. Let's just pause here for a minute. He's had a fight with his father in the streets.
Yeah.
He's been taken to a secure facility. after an indeterminate period, he's back at the university and he's seeing a GP for his ongoing delusions about communications with angels?
Yeah, I think even more a little concerning for me on that, if I'm reading that timeline right. So July 21st, etc., he's had his first visit with Dr. Barry, as you said. But by early August, due to medication, his delusions have completely ceased. That seems... something about that doesn't sit right, because to my reckoning, that's 2, 3, 4 weeks maximum. That seems like an incredibly quick time and turnaround to go from that state of, what did you say before? Although people around him were concerned, it was just a magical time to him, and having delusions around this to within 4 weeks being completely ceased and having a spring in his step.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that.
Okay.
I'm going to challenge you this way. If Cy Walsh has been taking psychotropic drugs up to this point, and he's off the psychotropic drugs, but he's still reporting delusions, and within 4 weeks of being medicated, those delusions have ceased, does that suggest to you that his condition was drug-induced, or does it suggest that his condition required medical intervention? Because that's the question I was grappling with in that moment.
Yeah.
Seconds before, I'm reading a document that's got me thinking, this is going to be a drug-induced psychosis case.
Yeah.
Now I'm flipping back the other way, reading this as a journalist, going, well, hang on. That sounds to me like treatment is effective.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what I think and feel about that at the moment, Sean. It's a great point that you raised, though. Is this a situation of drug-induced schizophrenia or an incident, or is it a situation of untreated schizophrenia or mental condition which is causing these delusions? And now that we've had a situation where we've had a visit to a GP and been able to put under correct medication for this situation, suddenly we're able to get that under control and these delusions cease and we come back to some form of normality. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit confused by this at this stage. I'm not exactly sure where I sit. This is very, very interesting, dicey ground for me from a perspective of a lens of 269 over all of this. We've got an incident, we've got drug use here, but we potentially have a medical condition, and once we get it under some medication, we may even be able to control that. I'm not quite sure where I sit right now.
Now, it wasn't just Dr. Paula Barry who was saying that Cy Walsh had a bit of a new lease on life, a bit of a spring in his step. Stephen Trobiani, in his witness statement, said that he spoke to Cy after the brawl as well.
Okay.
When Cy spoke to me about the fight, he quoted the movie Fight Club and thought it was a noble thing for him to fight his dad, and he was proud of it, Mr. Trobiani said. Cy said that he was in peak physical condition and he was proud of his dad for being able to beat him in a physical fight, even though he was much older than Cy. Peak physical condition. The same young man who had been talking about his congenital knee condition, who had been ashamed of it, who had felt like his dad didn't value him enough for it. I'm seeing complete differences in presentation to people here. Cy's telling one set of people one thing, another set of people the other. Bit of bravado here, bit of self-confidence lacking there. This is a point where Meredith Walsh comes back into our story. Now, of course, Cy's mum. She, like her husband, was very, very concerned. And in fact, all the time that he'd been in Greylands, however long that had been, she'd been making visits and speaking with him.
Okay.
What she heard didn't match what everyone else was hearing, and she remained concerned. She said in her witness statement, "When I talked to Cy about Phil, he kept going into a fighting stance whenever he talked about his father. He wanted to punch him, and he just said to me, 'Look, the devil's in my father. The devil is in my father.'"
While he's in Greylands, and we know he's there under supervision for a condition at this stage, getting treatment, he's quite aggressively saying that the devil is in his father. So obviously at that point, he's got some outlook perspective that whatever's going on from a adversarial perspective, whatever it is, it's his father, or whatever is inside his father is what he needs to be sort of at conflict with.
Or as Dr. Ann Bell put it in her provisional diagnosis, uncharacteristic violence toward father and poorly framed paranoid delusions. That's the clinical version.
Yeah, okay.
Meredith, obviously concerned about this, confides in Graham Watt, longtime family friend.
Okay.
And Mr. Watts says, Meredith has said to me on a few occasions following the Perth incident that she hopes Cy doesn't hurt Phil.
Yeah.
I told her that Phil's a big guy, strong and fit, and can look after himself. And I tell you, my stomach just dropped when I read that.
Yeah. Look, in hindsight's a wonderful thing that you hear that statement in hindsight and you go, oh. In real time, though, we've just seen an instance where Phil was able to best Cy in a physical confrontation. So that statement makes a lot of sense, and especially if he's trying to reassure Meredith at this point, it's going to be okay. I understand you've got concern that Cy may try to harm his father. Phil's a big guy. He can look after himself. In real time, that statement makes sense. In hindsight, and reading it as you were in that office that day, I can understand how your stomach must have flipped.
Well, there's that, but there's also the torn hamstring. You know, I mean, I'm no sporting person, but it's not easy to tear a hamstring. There's a fair amount of exertion involved, I'm assuming, in tearing a hamstring.
In an altercation like that, yes, there can be.
Yeah. So maybe Mr. Watt didn't know. Maybe that was something only Kane Corns knew. But again, I'm looking at this from the overview. You know, I'm like a drone flying over the top of all this, and all the pieces are finally starting to fit together for me at this time.
Yeah, I think when you talk about that, those pieces fitting together, I feel like this is going to be, and we talked about at the top of the episode, some of that new information, or perhaps to a level, depth, degree that the majority of people aren't going to understand at this point. This happened a full 12 months before the final incident that we know that would end up taking Phil's life. So this information here is very interesting because before you and I investigated this and before I spoke to you about this, I wasn't aware of this myself. And I was across the case. I knew the case had happened. I didn't hear any of this come out. I didn't know anything about this. And I guess in a context perspective, this changes the thought process and dynamic. And I'm not sure in which way, but it changes the thought process just from the fact that this wasn't a one-time isolated incident at Glenelg that night that took Phil's life. There was an ongoing circumstance that sat deeply within the family environment and deeply within Cy's own psychosis and his own conscience and all of those things that made him up who he was that were driving this from a long way back. There's a build-up. And I mean, we always know there's a build-up that we don't necessarily know much about. This to me is new information, new understanding, and a new perspective, certainly for me, and I would imagine for a lot of our listeners, which I'm going to put this bluntly, I hope is challenging them to think about how they think about this situation. I go back to when we talked a few episodes ago, Sean. It's very, very easy to get caught up in that emotional context of this is our coach. What a horrible thing for a man in that position to have happen to him. And we know, I guess, that the notoriety and the status he has within those roles and his career and his professionalism. Notwithstanding that, this is a situation, circumstance that could happen to any family, anywhere in the state, the country, whatever it might be, any family in any community environment. So this is complex for me because this is a very different piece of context in that sense. With all that stated, I want to ask you, and we're going to play a little bit of abstract of the mind here. I'm sitting here in real time, in 2021, thinking this through, taking this information in moment by moment as you're delivering this to me and trying to digest that. I'm going to suggest it was very similar to you sitting in a court's office, in 2015, doing much the same as you read document by document, taking this and piecing all this together. So if I can connect my real-time brain now with your 2015 brain then...
Time travel is possible, folks.
Absolutely. We're going to test this theory out. Talk to me right now about knowing what you know up to this point in 2015, as you sit in that office and you've read through this documentation and you've strung that red string together. What are you thinking? Are you thinking this is a drug-induced situation? Are you thinking it's a mental situation? Are you thinking it's a combination? Do you have an understanding of what you think right now?
At this point in time, in 2015, I'm absolutely reeling. I keep telling you all that there's no such thing as an unbiased journalist. There's only the journalist who removes their bias and tells the story.
Yeah.
One of the things I pride myself on is trying not to prejudge a situation before I report on it.
Yeah.
I try to just allow the evidence to wash over me so that way I'm reporting it with as little bias as I can manage as a human being.
Yeah.
I'm deep in the pool of bias right now.
Mm-hmm.
I've got friends and family telling me alternately that Cy was a weird kid who they didn't understand, and I'm feeling some empathy toward that because of my own status as a black sheep.
Yeah.
I've got people telling me Cy was this lovable misfit who just needed somebody to give him a bit of a chance.
Yeah.
I'm hearing about ayahuasca. I'm hearing about congenital knee defects. I'm hearing about this father-son relationship that, depending on who you speak to, is either two loving men who just can't quite connect, or something that's really antagonistic and possibly bordering on very cold and separated due to circumstance, through nobody's fault. It was really hard to try to grab hold of this while I'm desperately taking as many notes as I can in as short a time as I possibly can.
Yeah.
It felt like riding a whirlwind. The only thing that I could really piece together in that moment was, how confusing must this be for investigators? Because they are dealing with all of this as well. They've presented all of this to a court, and it really did feel like in that moment to me that it's all going to come down to that strand of hair.
Okay.
That strand of hair that's been taken for a toxicology analysis. Does that have drugs in it? Does it not? Because it's almost like that piece of hair is going to point down which pathway this is going to go. Me and myself at that moment, I'm incapable of deciding whether or not this is a 269 or a drug case, because I've got two very strong sets of evidence telling me the opposite to each other.
So conflicting opinions, ideas, concepts. So you're in a state of flux right now.
Absolute flux.
Okay.
I don't know what to think about this, except I can see why they don't normally give us these documents.
And I'll be honest, as I sit here right now, I'm still undecided.
But the one thing that I am definitive of, at that time and to this day, is that the Greylands incident is criminally overlooked when it comes to thinking back on, interpolating and understanding this incident.
Yeah.
There is so much context that comes out of that entire incident in Perth. As you said, a year earlier, violence, threats, delusional statements, a knife being involved around that period as the weapon of choice, for want of a better term. There are so many facets and elements of Greylands that would play out again 12 months later in Glenelg that I think we just can't afford to ignore the Perth stuff when coming to our thoughts and our feelings on the incident.
Now that we're here at this point, what came next?
The incident itself. That's what came next. Because the last set of documentation, again, we've artificially divided this, the last set of documentation was about the 36 hours leading up to the death of Phil Walsh. And Daniel, I will never forget turning over the witness statement of Sharon Watt, Graham Watt's wife, because she says on the very first page of that document that 36 hours before Phil Walsh died, Cy Walsh came to her at her home and said, "I'm going to get a knife and I'm going to stab him." He was making a stabbing motion with his right arm, bringing it from about head height down about 3 or 4 times. He said, "I just want to get him and stab him and cut his heart out."
And with that, we will pick this up to get to the part that I'm sure most of us think we know about, and that we will unpack and dissect in much more detail the incident of the night when Phil Walsh lost his life. Until we get there, once again, we want to remind you of some of the available resources that can provide advice, guidance and mental health support. The South Australian Government Mental Triage Health Service on 131 465, the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line 131 466, or whatever available resources may be open to you in your area. Until then, thank you to everyone who's listened to the broadcast on 5AA, or if you've listened to the podcast on either iTunes or Spotify, please, as always, go rate, review, subscribe, all of those things. Please continue to send through your feedback around this series and everything we've done at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, or at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can, of course, follow Sean with all of Adelaide's true crime news at Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. And until we follow up and we pick this story up yet again, we want to remind you one more time. Enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.